I've always believed that most conflicts start small, quietly, the kind you brush off because you assume common sense will eventually show up. That's how this began. I live by a lake, far from subdivisions and neat rows of identical houses. My property is older, rugged, and private, and sitting in my driveway like a piece of living history is my vintage truck. It's not flashy, but it's restored with care, registered legally, and more importantly, it's mine. The trouble started the morning I noticed a printed notice taped to my windshield. No envelope, no official seal, just a bold heading that read, HOA enforcement warning. I laughed at first. I'm not in an HOA. I never have been. I double-checked my deed years ago when I bought the land specifically to avoid this nonsense. Still, the paper claimed my truck violated community aesthetic standards and demanded it be removed within 48 hours or face seizure. Seizure. That word stuck with me. HOAs love dramatic language, but this crossed into fantasy. I crumpled the notice and tossed it, assuming that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next day, a black SUV slowed as it passed my driveway. Then another. Both had cheap magnetic decals on the doors that said Community Patrol. That's when my amusement shifted into something colder. On the third day, they showed up. Two men stepped out wearing dark uniforms that looked almost like police gear, if you didn't know what to look for. Badges, radios, utility belts, the whole performance. One of them started filming my truck with his phone while the other announced they were there to enforce HOA compliance. He said the truck was being seized due to repeated violations. I asked a simple question. Under what authority? He avoided eye contact and handed me a laminated card with the HOA's logo and the word, officer, printed underneath his name. Not law enforcement. Not county. Not state. Just confidence and intimidation. They told me I had no choice, that the tow was already on its way, and that resisting would make things worse. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that comes from watching people abuse authority they don't have. I kept my voice calm and told them again that I wasn't in their HOA and that they were trespassing. One of them smirked and said, "Everyone's in the HOA whether they like it or not." That's when I realized this wasn't ignorance. It was entitlement. As the tow truck turned onto my road, I knew this was about to escalate. Neighbors had started watching from a distance. Phones were out. The fake officers straightened their shoulders, clearly enjoying the audience. I reached into my jacket, not in anger, not in panic, but with certainty. I had hoped I'd never need to do this at home, on my own land. But some lessons only land when the truth is unavoidable. What they didn't understand was that this wasn't about a truck anymore. It was about lines being crossed and boundaries ignored. I watched their posture, the way they mimicked authority without respecting it. Every badge, every patch, every command was borrowed power. The lake was still, the air tense, and I could feel the moment stretching, waiting. I took a breath, steady and deliberate, knowing that once I spoke next, the story would change direction. Some confrontations fade away. Others expose exactly who people really are. This was the kind of moment that decides whether intimidation wins or accountability finally steps into the daylight for everyone watching silently. The tow truck rolled closer, its engine idling like it already owned my driveway. Gravel crunched under its tires as the driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, eyes moving between my truck and the two so-called HOA officers. They nodded at him like seasoned professionals, already acting as if the outcome was settled. One of them announced loudly that the vehicle was approved for immediate removal, making sure the neighbors could hear. It was theater, pure and simple. I raised my hand and told the tow driver to stop. I said the vehicle was not authorized for seizure and that these men had no legal authority over my property. He hesitated, glancing at the uniforms, the badges, the radios. That hesitation was exactly what they were counting on. One of the HOA cops stepped in, voice sharp, warning the driver that interfering could make him liable. The word hung there, heavy and misleading. I asked again, slower this time, for their legal documentation. Not HOA rules. Not bylaws. Actual authority. The taller one puffed up and said they were empowered to act as law enforcement, within the community. I almost laughed, but I didn't. I'd seen this before. People dressing confidence up as legitimacy and hoping no one would challenge it. He added that failure to comply could result in arrest for obstruction. That was the moment the situation stopped being ridiculous and became dangerous. Threatening arrest without authority isn't just overreach, it's impersonation. I told them to step back from my truck. They didn't. One of them put his hand on the door handle like he was daring me to react. Cameras from across the road were pointed straight at us now. This was no longer private intimidation, it was public. I felt the familiar discipline kick in, the one drilled into me long before I ever owned this land. Keep your tone neutral. Keep your hands visible. Let them talk themselves into the hole they're digging. I asked the tow driver directly who hired him. He said the HOA management company. Asked if he'd seen a court order. He shook his head. The shorter HOA cop snapped at him to stay quiet. I told them, clearly, that they were trespassing, attempting unlawful seizure, and impersonating officers. The taller one scoffed and said, "You don't get to decide that." He leaned in closer, voice low, and told me I should think carefully before escalating. The irony almost hurt. They had already crossed every line imaginable, but in their minds, they were untouchable. That's when I reached inside my jacket again, slowly this time. The shift was immediate. Both of them stiffened, hands hovering near their belts. I stopped halfway and told them to relax, that I was retrieving identification. I pulled out my wallet and opened it, holding it at chest level, so everyone could see. Inside was my badge. Not borrowed. Not laminated nonsense. Real. Federal. For a second, neither of them reacted. Then their eyes focused. The smirk vanished first. Then the confidence. The taller one's jaw tightened, like his brain was scrambling to reject what he was seeing. "What's that supposed to be?" he asked, but his voice cracked just enough to give him away. I stated my name, my position, and the agency I work for.
Calm.
Professional. Final. I explained that they were currently involved in multiple federal offenses, including impersonation, unlawful seizure, and intimidation. I informed them that every second they remained on my property, without lawful authority, made their situation worse. The lake breeze felt colder suddenly, sharper. The tow driver stepped back on his own. The shorter HOA cop swallowed hard and took a step away from my truck. The taller one didn't move, but his eyes did. They darted to the neighbors, to the cameras, to the badge again. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone could feel it. This wasn't about bravado or revenge. It was about reality catching up. They had walked onto my land believing intimidation would carry them through. Instead, they were standing face to face with consequences they hadn't planned for. And for the first time since they arrived, they were completely silent. Silence can be louder than shouting. The two HOA cops stood frozen, their confidence draining away in real time as the weight of what they'd done began to settle in. The neighbors across the road didn't move either. Phones stayed raised. No one wanted to miss what came next. The tow truck driver cleared his throat, then quietly stepped back toward his cab, already distancing himself from the mess. I told the taller one to remove his hand from his belt. He hesitated, then complied. That hesitation told me everything. People with real authority don't freeze when challenged. People pretending to have it do. Asked for their real names, not the ones printed on their fake badges. The shorter one started to speak, then stopped, looking at his partner like he was waiting for permission. He didn't get it. I explained, clearly and without raising my voice, that impersonating law enforcement is a serious offense, especially when used to threaten arrest or seize property. I pointed to the cameras around us and told them that everything they'd said and done was now documented. I could see panic starting to replace arrogance. The taller one tried to recover, mumbling something about acting under HOA legal advice. That excuse fell flat the moment he said it. I asked who authorized them to dress like police, carry radios, and threaten civilians. No answer. I asked if they had any formal training, any commissioning, any legal standing at all. Again, nothing. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and revealing. One of the neighbors whispered something to another. Someone else started walking closer. I told them to step off my property immediately. Not as a request, as a lawful order. The shorter one obeyed instantly, backing away toward their SUV. The taller one lingered, pride battling fear. I reminded him that refusal would add trespassing to an already long list of charges. That did it. He took a step back, then another. Before they reached their vehicle, I told them to leave the uniforms, the badges, and the radios in plain view. They protested weakly, saying they needed them for their job. I corrected them. Those items were evidence. The word landed hard. After a moment of whispered argument between them, they unclipped the radios and set them on the hood of their SUV. One badge followed, then the other. The tow truck engine started again, but this time it was leaving. The driver rolled down his window and apologized, eyes wide. I told him he was free to go and advised him to be careful who he took calls from in the future. He nodded and pulled away, tires kicking up dust as if he couldn't leave fast enough. I turned back to the HOA cops and told them to sit on the curb. That finally broke the last of their resistance. They complied, shoulders slumped, staring at the ground. The uniforms that had made them feel powerful minutes earlier now looked like costumes in bad light. I contacted the appropriate authorities and calmly explained the situation, giving names, descriptions, and a summary of events. While we waited, the taller one tried to speak, saying this was all a misunderstanding. I cut him off and told him misunderstandings don't involve threats of arrest and unlawful seizure. He nodded, eyes fixed on the dirt. The shorter one looked physically ill. Reality has a way of doing that when it finally arrives. When the first official vehicle appeared at the end of the road, the crowd exhaled as one. This was no longer neighborhood drama. It was a legal matter. I watched as real officers stepped out, professional and composed, and I briefed them on everything that had happened. They listened carefully, asked precise questions, and examined the fake gear laid out on the SUV. The contrast was impossible to miss. Real authority doesn't shout. It doesn't posture. It doesn't need an audience. Standing there on my own driveway, with my truck untouched and the truth fully exposed, I felt no satisfaction, only resolve. Abuse of power, even fake power, spreads when no one stops it. Today, it stopped here. The arrival of real officers changed the energy instantly. The neighbors who had been whispering now spoke openly, some pointing, others replaying recordings on their phones. Statements were taken carefully one by one. The fake HOA cops avoided eye contact with everyone, especially the people who had watched them threaten and posture just minutes earlier. Their earlier confidence felt like a distant memory. I walked the officers through the timeline from the first notice on my windshield to the attempted seizure. I showed them the printed warning, the laminated fake IDs, and the magnetic community patrol decals peeled off their SUV doors. Each item told the same story, deliberate impersonation designed to intimidate. One officer shook his head quietly, noting how closely the uniforms mimicked real law enforcement. That wasn't an accident. It was calculated. The HOA men were separated and questioned individually. That's when the story began to unravel. One claimed they were just enforcing rules. The other said the HOA board told them it was legal. Neither could name a statute. Neither could explain why arrest threats were made. Every answer contradicted the last. Watching it unfold, I was reminded how quickly lies collapse when there's no authority left to hide behind. A supervisor arrived and asked me directly if I wanted to press charges. I said yes, without hesitation. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. This wasn't a misunderstanding to smooth over. This was a warning sign of something that could have gone far worse if the wrong homeowner had been targeted. Intimidation works best on people who don't know their rights. That's exactly why it has to be challenged. The fake officers were informed they were being detained pending further investigation. When the words landed, one of them finally looked up, eyes wide. He asked if this was really happening. The answer was simple: yes. Uniforms don't grant authority. Actions have consequences. The neighbors watched as the men were placed into separate vehicles. No sirens, no drama, just quiet accountability. As the scene settled, people approached me. Some apologized for not stepping in earlier. Others thanked me for standing my ground. One older neighbor admitted she'd been threatened by the same HOA group months ago and had complied out of fear. That confession hit harder than anything else that day. This wasn't an isolated stunt.
It was a pattern.
I encouraged her to speak with the officers, and she did. More neighbors followed. Stories surfaced about fines, threats, and aggressive visits. The officers took notes, exchanged looks, and made calls. What started as an attempted truck seizure was now clearly something larger. Abuse thrives in silence, and silence had finally broken. When the official vehicles left, my driveway felt strangely quiet. The lake reflected the late afternoon light, calm and indifferent to the chaos that had played out. My truck sat exactly where it had that morning, untouched. I rested my hand on the hood, feeling the solid metal beneath my palm. This wasn't about winning. It was about protecting something that mattered. That evening, I reviewed the footage neighbors had shared with me. Every threat, every false claim of authority, every moment of intimidation was crystal clear. Evidence doesn't argue. It simply exists. I knew this would continue beyond today, into investigations, hearings, and consequences that couldn't be avoided or negotiated away. As the sun dipped lower, I thought about how easily this could have ended differently if I'd panicked, or if I'd stayed silent. Power, even fake power, relies on compliance. The moment it's questioned, it starts to crumble. Standing there on my land, with the truth fully exposed, I felt a quiet certainty settle in. They came for my truck thinking I'd fold. Instead, they revealed themselves. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. In the days that followed, the situation didn't fade away like neighborhood gossip. It expanded. Official inquiries were opened, statements were formalized, and the HOA's activities came under real scrutiny. What had once been dismissed as overzealous enforcement was now being examined for what it truly was: a coordinated pattern of intimidation built on borrowed authority and fear. I was contacted by investigators who wanted everything: emails, notices, recordings, timelines. I gave them all of it. The footage from that day alone painted a clear picture, but combined with testimonies from other homeowners, it became undeniable. The HOA board members who had authorized the uniforms and patrols suddenly stopped returning calls. Their confidence vanished the moment real accountability entered the conversation. Word spread quickly through the area. People who had quietly complied for years started asking questions. Some realized for the first time that the HOA had no jurisdiction over their property at all. Others learned that fines they'd paid were never enforceable. The illusion cracked, and once people saw through it, they couldn't unsee it. The two men involved were formally charged with impersonation and unlawful seizure attempts. The management company distanced itself immediately, claiming ignorance. That defense didn't hold up for long. Paper trails have a way of surviving panic. Meetings were canceled. Lawyers appeared. Resignations followed. The structure that relied on intimidation collapsed under its own weight. As for me, life returned to its quiet rhythm. Mornings by the lake. Evenings in the garage. My vintage truck remained exactly where it belonged, not as a symbol of defiance, but of ownership. No one bothered it again. No notices. No patrols. No threats. Silence this time felt earned. Neighbors still stopped by occasionally, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to say thank you. A few admitted they'd been scared to challenge the HOA before, worried about retaliation. Seeing that fear replaced with confidence is something I won't forget. One confrontation shifted the balance for an entire community. This wasn't about flexing a badge or proving a point. It was about boundaries. Authority has limits. Power requires legitimacy. And intimidation only works when people believe they have no choice. The moment someone stands up calmly and lawfully, the illusion dissolves. I didn't seek this fight, but I don't regret how it ended. Some lines exist for a reason. When they're crossed, silence becomes permission. That day, silence broke. And once it did, everything changed. The lake still reflects the sky the same way it always has. The truck still starts with a familiar rumble. And the land remains what it was meant to be: mine, undisturbed, protected not by threats or uniforms, but by truth.